Scott started, he's a lawyer. He started as a judicial clerk at the Alaska Supreme Court. Then he came to us, Western Watersheds Project, and was our Idaho director for a time until he left in 2020 to be the Nevada staff attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity. So CBD, they have a Great Basin program, and they work through law, policy, and creative media to conserve rare and imperiled wildlife and plants. And Scott is going to talk to us about some of the practical legal hooks that we might have for conserving and doing our work. So here's Scott.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to get going pretty quickly because I don't think I have a lot of time, and I might go pretty quickly through some of my slides, but I don't think you'll be missing anything because the stuff that I'm not going to cover, I think Allison and Arnold probably covered well enough. So as Laura mentioned, I'm a lawyer, and what she didn't mention is that my very first case as a public interest environmental lawyer was a mechanical vegetation treatment project. And since that time, this has been an issue that has been sort of unavoidable and also very frustrating because I think there are things that set it apart from some of the other issues that we tend to work on. I think the main thing is that as opposed to, things like livestock grazing or logging and forestry, the connection to economic development and industry is pretty attenuated. And the agency, because of that, the agencies are able to craft a bunch of narratives around these projects that makes them seem incredibly beneficial. And as Allison pointed out, that's not necessarily the case. But I wanted to kind of dig into that aspect of it because one question that keeps coming up in my work, came up with that first project and comes up even today, is why do we keep doing this? And it can be very very frustrating because I have a case right now in front of the Ninth Circuit where the government is arguing that Pinyon-Juniper removal is necessary to restore the natural fire regime, and that Pinyon-Juniper removal will reduce invasive annual grasses. This is a project that Allison's lit review is in the record for. And it's like some of this stuff just goes in one ear and out the other. So I kind of wanted to get down to why that happens and maybe something we can do about it. So I'm going to start my presentation now, if I can get PowerPoint to work. Get PowerPoint and Zoom to work at the same time. Hold on a second. Oh. Ah. Okay. Okay. Sorry about the confusion here. When I went to PowerPoint, my oh, looks like I can't share my screen.
Scott, someone's coming to help you.
Okay. Well, there's some dead air here, so I will try to start while this is being worked out. Just to sort of give you a little background on how we at the center and how I...
Scott, try it now.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Okay, can everybody see that?
Momentarily, we will be able to see it. Just hang tight 1 second, we'll let you know.
Okay.
We can see it on the laptop here. There we go.
Okay, Scott.
Okay. All right, still there?
Yes.
Yep, you got us.
Okay. Okay, so this is just a little bit of background on how I engage with these projects at the center. You know, even though I'm a lawyer, we don't really end up in court over very many of these projects. There are definitely projects that we do sue over. Um, Generally, in these projects, there are components that are bad and there are components that are not so bad. Um, we generally try to pressure the agencies to remove some of the bad components. It's very rare that we outright try to stop a project. That said, there are some, including several in eastern Nevada, western Utah, that do use some pretty concerning methods like chaining, which is mentioned earlier, that we are attempting to stop. As Laura mentioned, our focus is on species and plant preservation, and particularly sage grouse and pinyon jay. Um, these projects can have adverse impacts for both of those, even though they're often pitched as habitat restoration for sage grouse. So in the very little time that I have, I'm going to give a quick historical overview, and then talk about some of the ways that the sort of narrative around Pinyon-Juniper removal is evolving. So basic point, we have this history in which Pinyon-Juniper is basically managed as either an invasive nuisance or, short of that, undesirable vegetation. The impacts of treatments and the effects of treatments is much more studied than at the actual ecology of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands themselves. They are an incredibly understudied ecosystem as an ecosystem. So, we know a whole lot about how Pinyon-Juniper encroachment affects sage grouse. What we don't really know is the extent to which species like the pinyon jay and others depend on these ecosystems and what happens when these ecosystems get removed. And I think, as Arnold pointed out, these are, fully developed ecosystems in and of themselves. I think, the phrase "we don't see the forest for the trees" is a cliche, but I think here it's really, really accurate, because a lot of times managers are looking at individual trees thinking, oh, those shouldn't be there, or oh, we could have something else here, and not seeing the system, which is the forest. So in the early days, there was a more explicitly economic impetus to these projects. First, they were, forest clearing was associated with mining, early settlement, and then later it was associated with livestock grazing and trying to increase forage for livestock. You can see the legacy of this across the Great Basin. The photo on this slide is a non-native grass seeding in Egan Valley, Nevada, in eastern Nevada. It's several years, maybe several decades old, but you see patches of land like this all across public lands in Nevada where the native vegetation has basically been eliminated and replaced with non-native forage grasses. Habitat restoration. So actually, I think the idea that Pinyon-Juniper removal benefits wildlife sort of, and ungulates especially, sort of predates the sage grouse rationale by a little bit. And it's essentially a offshoot of the idea that removing trees creates forage for cattle. The idea is that if forage is a limiting factor for big game, then tree removal should benefit big game. That's not always the case. And in fact, there's a very complex relationship between big game species and Pinyon-Juniper forest that is not always acknowledged. And then we come to sage grouse. And this is actually the one sort of general justification for Pinyon-Juniper removal that we see actually having some scientific backing. I think that scientific backing can be very misused in this context by the agencies. And basically what we see is that studies are showing sage grouse, have higher occupancy and, based on some statistical methods, higher nest success in areas where trees have been removed. and where the understory is healthy and has been preserved. So, all of these studies basically assume that we're working with an intact native sagebrush bunchgrass understory. Obviously, this research isn't really a good basis to recommend chaining, which removes all vegetation, or prescribed fire, which is generally not recommended in sagebrush habitats in general. But we see the agencies relying on these studies, and particularly the Severson 2017 study that I cited on this slide, to justify those things. So there's sort of a lack of nuance, and a lack of sort of deep engagement with some of this stuff, even though there is science to support some mechanical vegetation treatments. From this point on, you're going to see a lot of aftermath photos. These were taken by my colleague Patrick Donnelly in Spring Valley, Nevada. These are recent. This is about half a year old, and it's a chaining project. As you can see, it basically removes all vegetation. There are some tiny little grasses and shrubs hanging on in there, but it's much of the native vegetation has been removed. And like I said, even though there is some science supporting this stuff for sage grouse habitat restoration, a lot of projects on public lands do not really follow what the science is recommending when we get down to the details. And then there's wildfire, and I think this is an area where that really impacts my work as an attorney, and in working with basically policy-based campaigns, because fire is an incredibly emotional issue, and it seems like something the agencies are always able to trot out as a justification, even though, as Alice had mentioned, there really isn't a lot of scientific backing for the idea that removing trees or removing sagebrush restores natural fire intervals. So, I think the idea that we're preventing wildfire, or preventing property damage, or preventing, natural resource damage, wildlife habitat damage, is incredibly attractive to the agencies. And even though there's a lack of scientific rigor here, I think the impetus to do more of this is really based in concerns over wildfire, and you especially see this in legislation. I think there was a component touching on this in the Fix Our Forests Act, and there have definitely been laws passed through Congress that make it easier to remove pinyon-juniper trees on the assumption that it's an effective wildfire prevention tool. And this is something that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, and it's interesting. In Eastern Nevada, at least, and I think maybe across the state of Nevada, you are seeing somewhat of a retreat from the idea that we have to present these projects as restoration. It still sort of has a greenwashed sheen to it, but there is a major push to basically turn pinyon-juniper forests into a biofuel resource. And this is incredibly concerning, because I think what it means is it's creating essentially a demand for pinyon-juniper removal where before there was none. I think in terms of resources and investment of time, these projects are really a loss for the agencies. They do this because they think it benefits other uses like livestock grazing. When harvested pinyon-juniper trees becomes a use in and of itself, I think we're in trouble, and that seems to be the direction that we're headed in. The state of Nevada just signed an agreement with the government of, let me see. This is a different project. The government of Denmark to create a biofuel plant in Eastern Nevada, essentially, that's going to be, the feedstock of that is supposed to be pinyon-juniper trees. And there's this other really sort of mind-boggling project on the Inyo National Forest. It's featured on this slide. This is I'm going to do my best to describe this, but this is basically a project where trees are being cut down chipped up, dried, heated, and turned into a condensed liquid that is then injected underground and pitched as climate mitigation or carbon removal. I can't wrap my head around how this got legs in the first place. But it is, and you see the quote from the National Forest Foundation there, that the Indian National Forest is a biomass utilization desert. This is really one of the only contexts where I've seen people just come out and say, basically before the Trump administration, I guess, but come out and say, we need more logging, not less. And I think my point in going through all these different rationales is that this stuff is, for activists and people like myself, this stuff is kind of a moving target. And it makes it hard to find, sort of workable solutions to some of these problems because you have so many different interests and, often powerful interests invested in the removal of Pinyon-Juniper trees. You've got, and it builds over time as different rationales are trotted out, different people get on board. So at first you had the livestock industry, and then you had the livestock industry and sort of the hook and bullet groups. And now you have the livestock industry, the hook and bullet groups, and some sage grouse conservation advocates. And then after that, you add on people who are concerned about wildfire. And after that, add the climate mitigation crowd, and it just keeps on growing and growing. And it seems like there's an ever-growing constituency out there for the mechanical removal of Pinyon-Juniper trees, which makes fighting these projects extremely difficult. A few points I want to make in closing. I think Pinyon-Juniper, as this sort of very brief historical overview shows, I think Pinyon-Juniper removal and mechanical treatments are a solution in search of a problem. It's like we're constantly going out and trying to define what the problem is so we can keep doing this thing that we've been doing for over 100 years. Pinyon-Juniper forests are understudied, and they're the subject of misinformation. It doesn't seem like it matters how many times Allison updates and republishes her lit review. We still hear the same old quote unquote conventional wisdom coming out of the agencies, like this reduces invasive vegetation, or this restores natural fire cycles, or this benefits wildlife, even though most results are non-significant. And I think, my final closing point is the ecological and cultural value of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands is largely ignored. This is both sort of a scientific integrity issue and also, I think, an environmental justice issue, because a lot of these places, as Arnold touched on, are sacred to the indigenous inhabitants, and agencies rarely, if ever, take that into account. These are some practice tips. I'm being told to wrap up, and I think I'm not sure how many people this would benefit, so I'm just going to go very quickly through this. I'm just going to say that engaging early, building a strong record, and developing and proposing alternatives are really the key here. Like I said, it's very unlikely that we are able to stop an entire project, but we can make them better. And a lot of the stuff, there are some techniques like selective removal that are not nearly as damaging or don't have as long-lasting of impacts as like hugely ground-disturbing methods like chaining. So, the point is like, and, I'll also say like grazing. Grazing is something that has to be dealt with. And encouraging the agencies to sort of take a proactive and, informed approach to grazing, I think is important in that we really need to understand grazing as a confounding factor here, as Allison said, and there aren't a whole lot of studies doing that. It's important to see if the extent to which grazing is actually creating the problem. I think we need to have study some areas that are excluded from grazing, which are incredibly rare on public lands these days. And I will also just mention that this is, to any lawyers in the audience, I was not able to update this presentation in light of the Supreme Court's gutting of NEPA this morning. So some of these tips may not be relevant anymore, but I can't really comment on specifics. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up and we can move on to Q&A.
Thanks, Scott. That was a masterful job bringing us back into on time. So I think Grace is.
Yeah, we're going to
take
do
over.
a short Q&A for anyone who has questions for our panelists.
I have thanks everybody, good information. I have a question about the term significant. You mentioned it in the peer review, the literature review, significant. How do you define that? And the BLM uses the word, making significant progress towards land health. How do they define significant? Because from what I've seen, they keep using that phrase as if there's success when it isn't happening. So can you help?
So, sorry, I should have elucidated. We're talking about statistical tests and p-values. And if they didn't do that, then they weren't in the lit review.
Okay, more questions? Go.
This is a question for Allison. In your literature review, maybe I wasn't listening well, but did you address the relative damage of doing the vegetative conversions with spraying herbicides? In southern Arizona, they're using a lot of something called spike to basically they actually fly over the land and spray this stuff, broadcast it.
Right, to be included in the literature review, there had to be a mechanical vegetation removal. Some of these studies did multiple things. They looked at the chemical removal and or fire and or mechanical, and we would only take the data points that were mechanical removal of sagebrush or PJ. We ignored the chemical.
Thanks for your presentations, both of you. Appreciate it. Allison, you started talking about fire frequency, and I think you were going to tell us about Wyominensis and Basin Big, and then you didn't.
Yeah.
What are they?
Sorry, I was kind of rushing. When I practiced the talk, I could not get it under 20 minutes. So fire cycles in sagebrush communities vary from like 25, 30 years between fires in the more xeric, like Wyoming Basin Big Sage, to up to like 250, even 300 years fire intervals in like the higher elevation mountain big sage.
Questions? Go here first.
Thank you. Two questions for Scott. Did I catch that? Did the Supreme Court do something this morning that's important? And what was it? And secondly, what's the status of the Las Vegas water raid?
I will go in reverse order on that. The status of the Las Vegas water raid is indefinitely on hold. Interestingly, those photos I showed are from Spring Valley, where that was targeting. And one of the main beneficiaries, quote unquote beneficiaries of that, assuming that livestock will benefit, is the Southern Nevada Water Authority, which still maintains multiple ranches and runs their livestock on several BLM grazing allotments. So there is a nexus here to some extent. I don't think they're cutting down PJ trees in Spring Valley to create more water for Sunwa. But you could say that Sunwa's ranches are indirectly driving a demand for this kind of thing. And the Supreme Court today issued the 7-county infrastructure coalition case, which really cuts down on NEPA consideration of indirect and cumulative impacts, and changes the standard for judicial review of decisions under NEPA to be more favorable to the government. I haven't really fully digested it yet. I just, in my experience, most of our cases against particular mechanical vegetation treatment projects are brought under NEPA. So this is going to significantly change how we approach that.
Arnold, I wanted to thank you for sharing your worldview with us, especially when it comes to managing these lands. And through your speaking, it was clear your worldview and probably that of your culture is very different than what's manifested in the government. Do you have any hope that your worldview can influence those of us who grew up in a Western government, top-down, science-driven culture so that we can have better, more sustainable management of these public lands?
What would be important is to have people who are of indigenous background to be part of the group that you're within, like making your policies and your management issues and your decisions. Have a native that's a part of that. Whatever land that it's on, whichever tribe that's closest to that region will have stories and concerns about the landscape, about the vegetation, about the animals and wildlife and so forth. And so it has to be like a re-education, and also to come to the fact that that maybe we're going down the wrong road of development of all this of what we're doing to these like the Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, the forests that we have. And a lot of these, they're not they're what I would consider like mismanagement, because a lot of these policies that are created, especially the Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, the chaining process is done to improve the rangeland for livestock. We're not doing this for, like, they don't do that specifically for the wildlife. It's all this like cattle and sheep operations that are here. Way back about 1600s, all these rangelands and these community types were at their climate's level, their climate's what they could achieve as a community type. But since 1700s, especially early mid 1800s, everywhere across the Southwest there was like tens of thousands of cattle out here. Like in southern New Mexico, there was operations of like 80,000 cows. 80,000 one ranch, 70,000 in another ranch, 40,000 in another ranch. And these Texan cattlemen were coming up into Utah, and that's why, you know, they had to protect the lands up here. The early settlers, the Mormons that settle here, is the threat of the oncoming Texans that were bringing in their huge cattle operations as they did in southern New Mexico. So a lot of this land degradation that happened is happened like from the early 1800s. And on our reservation, it's the same thing. When they introduced the sheep to us, we had millions of sheep out there. And so the land got so degraded where by 1930s, they had to have a forced stock reduction, where John Collier came in and took all the livestock and destroyed them. He just literally shot them or whatever, buried them. And so that was a shocker to the Navajo people, having to see all these like piles and piles of dead sheep. But at that time, I think it was necessary in order to kind of get a restart on having the land recover. See, like my sheep operations that I have, I used to have over 200 head of sheep, and what I did is the past 5 years ago, I got rid of all of them. I have no more sheep or horses now because I'm experimenting right now. What I'm doing is I'm seeing how much the vegetation will come back. And since I've eliminated my herd, I've seen a lot of increases of the natural native grasses. A lot more of the native forbs are coming back. And so based on my own experimentation, I think it works that way. You got to find that balance. And then a lot of the meadows, like the high montane meadows, we take cattle up there. We keep them up there for months and months at a time, where they should take these cattle like until after like July or something, until after all the grasses have seeded out, and then let the seeds mature and let these cattle go in there or the sheep go in there, let them trample on, and their hooves can push that seeds back into the ground where it's going to encourage the repropagation of these native plants. So all that deep thinking and that deep management has to be brought into account. So thank you for your question.
Okay, we have 2 more questions.
Recently, the Forest Service undertook a mature and old growth inventory that identified Pinyon-Juniper as one of the last bastions of places you can find mature and old growth trees. What is the implication of those old growth Pinyon-Junipers for both cultural and religious purposes, for pinyon nut gathering, and for biodiversity and juniper obligate species? And what is that, how is that at risk from the massive scale deforestation projects that we're seeing these days?
I'll just chime in, but you should too, Arnold, on the cultural importance. I think generally the old growth PJ is more or less safe from these treatments. They're going after more and more these days the encroaching, and some of it is real encroachment, and some of it's recolonization into what should be a PJ site. But it's that phase 1 movement of the PJ into what is or looks like sagebrush systems. That's what they're mostly going after in these treatments. They can't really justify with their goals for watershed and ecological restoration cutting down mass quantities of the old growth. No way. So I'm not worried about that.
I am. Unfortunately, they are still doing that in Nevada. Some field offices. But basically, on comments on a project, within the last few years, I got a response that it doesn't matter if it's a PJ site or a sagebrush site or an old growth site or a phase 1 site. Getting rid of the trees helps sage-grouse was their line. So it is happening in some places.
The woodlands are, like I mentioned earlier, it's a source for all kinds of plants that we use culturally, ethnobotanically. The juniper tree itself has so many different uses. The bark itself is used as a fire starter. It's used as a stuffing material between logs of hogans, and it's also used as tobacco. You can actually use the shredded bark and roll it up with a corn husk and use it as a cigarette. A lot of our older elderlies, they used to do that is kind of like to give them a powerful mindset, and also to reset their balance and thinking in the mind. It re-clears their mind. Like in Western society, you see somebody standing outside like 7 to 11 just chain smoking. Have a cigarette, toss and grab another chain. Another. That's not done in Navajo society. Smoking is done reverently, and it's done with prayers and meditation and also with chanting, and it's to rebalance you in your life. And then also the berries are edible. The berries are edible as an emergency food. There's a lot of protein in it. If you get lost in the Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, you can survive on juniper berries until somebody rescues you. Then also the scales themselves, the image of the scales, they're imbricated, and how they're kind of like imbricated, going stacked on top of one another. That was our inspiration to how our ladies would finish off their Navajo baskets. If you look at a Navajo basket, it's woven like this. But if you look at a basket of other Indian tribes, they're just kind of looped around like this around the final loop. And that provides a stronger ending of it. And there's a story related to that as well. And then the juniper berries, the berries, the seeds themselves, there's old berries that you can find on the ground, and you find these berries with like little partitions, like little holes in them. And you poke a hole in them, and we use that for protection. It's protection against, like, if you have bad nightmares, if you have like some type of nightmares, or like a bad dream, or if you have some type of something that's spooking you, or it's like little kids, they have problems with being scared and somebody scaring them. So that's kind of like a protection little seed that we have that they make jewelry out of. And then also that same seed is also used to help you with your heartburn. If you have acid reflux and heartburn, you use that seed to get rid of that, alleviate that symptom. And then like I said earlier, the scales with the reddish tip where it flowered out, those are used, and we add those and burn it, get the ashes of that, mix it in with our corn food, like our blue corn, or add it to some of the meat that we produce. And what that does is it's a medicine within itself, not only as a flavor, but it has a lot of tannins in it, like tannic acids and stuff. And you can actually use it as a mordant for dye plants as well, to enriching your dye colors. And then the stems themselves, the stems are about that wide. Those are collected and cut like about that section. And when we have these ceremonial chants like the Nightway chant or the mountaintop chant, the 9-day, 9-night Nightway chant, they would create like prayer sticks out of those, what we call ketan, and they would paint these little figures on them, and they would represent all the different holy people that are associated with that particular chant. So just the juniper tree itself has so many uses. And then there's a whole suite of uses just for the pinyon pine as well. So in that fashion, it's very important for us to have that woodland that surrounds us. It provides us with homes. It provides us with building material, fencing material, like firewood. And so it's an all-around tree that's indispensable to us. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, last question of the day, or panel.
I'm not even sure how to frame this question. The contexts are so disparate. I've been sitting in rooms like this for 40 years in what I consider a very elitist movement, and it wasn't until just recent years, last 3 or 4 years, I've been sitting in rooms of folks that are working on restoration of bison and other species that are sacred to native tribes. So listening to these tribes talk about their relatives, four-legged relatives, bison, in their tribal languages at one meeting, 11 different tribal languages plus English. The disconnect I'm seeing and what I'm seeing moving forward in post-colonial settler cultural mindsets is braided science and woven science. Okay, I think so, but the disparate, there's such a disconnect because it's still, in my world, coming from, so this isn't a comfortable room for me. The room when 11 native languages are talking about buffalo, I'm comfortable there. The question is, I like the idea of braided science moving forward. I want to clone you, Arnold, because you've got, like, it's woven in your DNA, in your essence. So here's the thing, is that post-colonial settler mindset culture is very intellectual, and the culture that we live in is strictly transactional, commodified, and whereas I come from a culture that's completely relational, and I can't figure out how to bridge that gap. So when you're working with colonialist ethnobotanists, do you teach them the prayers? Are you teaching them the words? And so you can obviously touch their mind. Where do we go if we're going to use braided science to touch people's hearts? And have you had any success in that?
A lot of the teachings of Hajjon, Navajo way, the beauty way, and also the fundamental laws, the universal laws, and also the laws of nature, Mother Nature. It's I think it was intended for all races of men. And that's the way I was taught from my grandmother. She goes, this knowledge that you have, this extensive knowledge that you have of plants, of the earth, of our laws, of our concepts of living as among these holy beings, holy entities. He told me it's not your knowledge, it's not yours, it doesn't belong to you. You're just a temporary holder of that knowledge. The knowledge belongs to the people, especially the Navajo people, but if there's like a lot of other tribes, they've lost their culture, their language, so I try as much to teach them what I know about like Hajo, about the plants and about our holy plant people, our holy deities. And so you have to share it. And in order for me to continuously maintain my learning abilities, I have to, by sharing, I make room up in my mind. And when I share like that, when you open up that room, you constantly gain new knowledge in your thinking, in your mind. And you mentioned earlier about the bisons. My girlfriend, she raised like about 200 bisons. And just recently, she donated like about 90 head of bisons. No monetary exchange, just donated to a tribe that wanted to reestablish their herd. And so we call them a yana, the one that eats, that's eating all the time. And they're very important for our ceremonial system. They're very important they're responsible for maintaining and also responsible for carrying and overseeing the holy medicine people, all the medicine plants. There are several plants that we have there's one plant called Ayanabitsi, which means the buffalo hairs, which is Hymenopsis acalis variety bestiata, woolly base. So if you look at these Tetraneurus and Hymenopsis at their base, they have these tufts of white hairs, and that's like buffalo hair. And so that's a very important protection type of incense that we use, that we put on hot coals, and we fumigate ourselves and bless ourselves, say, Hajrona Shado. It's a very powerful ceremonial type of blessing that we receive from that. And then we have several different species of plants that we call Ayanabilij, means a place where the buffalo took a pee. And if you take out that plant will smell like buffalo pee. That's also a very sacred medicine, ceremonial plant that we have. And then we also, what I do is, when I go back to like Kansas, and like where they have all these buffaloes, I would go to their wallowing hole, like they'll have a buffalo wallow, where they roll around in the mud and so forth. And I would talk to them, I would pray to them, I would put corn pollen in each hoof, like this, where they were standing, and say, Hajona Nara, Hajona Shado, Shikawintlo. So that gives me ultimate protection and like goodness that comes to me that way. And so the buffalo people, they're very important. We even have stories about their horns. Their horns used to be turquoise a long time ago. The buffaloes had possession of all the turquoise in the Southwest. And then over here, us Navajos, we had all this possession of jet, black jet. And so the early holy people, they met up with the holy buffalo people, and then the buffalo said, we don't like our turquoise horns. We like that black color. Can you give us all your jet, and we'll give you all our turquoise? And when that exchange was made, from that point on, the buffalo horns turned black. And right now on the reservation, it's very rare to find black jet. And us Navajos, we have more than an abundant amount of turquoise that we have. So there's a lot of stories like that. And then also, when it comes to, you're talking about science versus cultural traditional knowledge, if you really intensely study the Navajo teachings, the Beauty Way teachings, the universal teachings, and also the teachings of all the different ceremonialism that we have, there's so much science that's embedded in there. I call it Navajo science. Our holy people went up into the heavens. They met all the star people. They came up with a classification of stars that we have for eons and decades. We talk about the red giants, the yellow stars, our sun. We talk about the white stars, the black holes. We knew about the black holes. We know about the brown stars. We know about the blue stars. It wasn't until recently, about 120 years ago, 100 years ago, NASA comes up and says, oh, we've discovered and made a classification of stars. Lo and behold, it's the same thing that we had for thousands of years. We have stories about all the behavior of animals. And one thing that Western science doesn't have, which they sorely need and sorely lack, is the metaphysical side of things. Like I described about how we could talk to the animals, the birds, how we can capture them. That part of science has not been, the Western science has not catch up with that. So, thank you.
Can we get a round of applause for our panelists, please?
I'll just say I dug up the last 2 copies of the 2019 Lit Review. I'll put them out on the SUA table, but if in a couple months, if you Google do mechanical vegetation treatments of PJ and sagebrush work, you'll go to ResearchGate, and the publication there will be updated with the new laid out version.
Thank you. Okay, great. So we kind of did our break backwards. So we're going to jump right into our last panel of the day, but